Every year, the National Urban League releases its highly anticipated report on the state of Black America. The report has become the national touchstone for the social and economic status of African American and Hispanic communities. This year's report, One Nation Underemployed, Jobs Rebuild America, addresses the growing and underemployment crisis and how African Americans and other communities of color can recover from the losses of the Great Recession and forge a path to economic stability and upward mobility. Each year, we ask the question, what is the state of Black America? Today, our esteemed panelists will answer that question as it relates to our cities. American cities have seen phenomenal growth, and yet rising income inequality and a jobs crisis have left so many out. We have a tale of two cities. Joining me, Chanelle Hardy, Senior Vice President for Policy and Executive Director of the National Urban League Washington Bureau, Jamal Simmons, Co-Chairman of the Internet Innovation Alliance, and Spencer Overton, Interim President of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Welcome, you all.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Chanelle, you have been doing this work, have been working with the development of this report, and this cities piece is a new nuance. You all took a look at 77 cities. Why 77? Dwindled down from 100. And what did that snapshot really show us that we can use to begin really addressing some of the issues at the municipal level?
Well, we chose cities that had a significant African American and Latino population. And from there, we actually ended up really featuring an even smaller number. Only 26 cities did we really look at for some particular findings around income inequality and unemployment inequality. So as you know, the Equality Index is our way of measuring year to year our progress toward our mission of economic parity. And so while the Equality Index, unsurprisingly, doesn't change greatly from year to year, because change takes time, what we do is use different opportunities like this year's analysis of the cities to see what we can add. And what we found is that, unsurprisingly, things aren't a lot different generally in the cities. There's still significant unemployment challenges for African Americans. Usually it's about 2 to 1. And there's significant income equality challenges, again, almost 2 to 1, as well as the wealth gap, which is a whole nother story. But what we found in particular that was interesting is that the findings where you're going to see the greatest levels of equality don't necessarily coincide with the levels of greatest prosperity more generally.
So with that, Jamal, if you can come in for a minute here, you know, it's almost like we're seeing schizophrenic cities, not really tales of two cities, where you have the data that needs to be looked at to show some of these disparities. What are some of the things that you're seeing, and what are some stopgaps that we can start putting in place?
So if we pull apart that data and start looking at the different communities inside of cities, what you see are really disparate neighborhoods. So a city like Washington, D.C., where Anacostia is probably one of the more economically depressed places in the country, and then you look at the upper Northwest, which is probably one of the wealthiest places in the country. Detroit, where Spencer and I are from, where you see that kind of disparity in stark relief. I look at this attacking this 3 ways. Employment is certainly something that we have to focus on. While we do that, we have to look at education, we have to look at entrepreneurship, and we have to look at equity. And so we want to make sure that our kids, who right now, let's take technology for example, our kids are testing, only 3% of AP test takers last year were African American, only 8% were Hispanic across the country. That's got to change in a world where we're seeing 1 million IT jobs expected to come online by 2022. We've got to get more kids in that pipeline. And then even if you get a job, if you're a doctor or a lawyer or a baker, you got to be an entrepreneur. You got to figure out what other ways you're going to be able to make money and grow along with your career. And then finally, equity. We've got to make sure also that people are being included and that the opportunities are being dispersed to those who deserve them, but maybe no one's looking in their direction to make sure they get a chance to participate.
Well, there's a lot to that. I mean, Spencer, as we talk about the equity piece,
right.
And we're looking at opportunity and pipeline, I think, is really part of it. Where are the organizations? Who should the organizations be? Who should the people be? And how do regular people, right, who want to be part of those pipelines, start getting involved in the development of those pipelines, whether it's at the municipal level or
right.
whether it's coming from the nonprofit sector?
Right. Well, obviously, the National Urban League is going to play a big role in terms of getting people in the proper pipelines. Infrastructure is so key. You know, we talk about individual effort, and folks definitely need to make an effort, right? but this infrastructure, so opportunity through creating a default where it's easy for folks to, get to school, get the training, have opportunity. So it's easy to start a job. This infrastructure piece, I think, is critical, Jeff.
But and this is for any of you, we're having some data theory discussions, but when the rubber meets the road, local politics is nasty. Right. Cities are strapped for cash. Most are dealing with incredible shortfalls. Most are dealing with incredible economic and industry shifts. Where are some of the cities that are getting this right? Not because things are perfect, but because they're utilizing resources in different kinds of ways. Because I think what people want to see is best practices. And so where are some of those cities?
Well, we found that some of those cities were Washington, D.C., unsurprisingly, Baltimore, New York, and Boston. Now, what's not surprising about any of these places is you have academia, so you've got the universities and the infrastructure that they build around them, but then also you have government. And we have not spent enough time on the conversation around government investment. You know, the president has had a number of ideas from the American Jobs Act proposal he had a few years back that talk about the need for government investment. And here's a classic example of how it works. Defense spending. Defense spending is a major job creator. These attempts that we're having, the conversations that we're having right now about rolling back and scaling back the defense budget are causing all kinds of fallout because that translates to job loss. But if we take that to the non-defense area, the same results are also seen. So there's definitely a role for a return to the conversation now that we've seen the deficit really starting to come down around government investment in infrastructure, which is going to create jobs, in education, what's going to create jobs. And a huge job creator right now is the success of the Affordable Care Act, because we have to have nurses and doctors and healthcare practitioners to serve these newly insured individuals. And there is a whole group of economic development opportunities that could arise from that. And I'll just stop with one example. We were speaking with the Oklahoma State Senator who just talked about just knowing that there was going to be funding for, that there were going to be newly insured people in the community, incentivize some investors to build an advanced care facility, and then it sprung up lunch places and hotels, and it became a driver of the economic improvement for the entire community. So there's some real opportunities.
Well, Jeff, and to pick up on that point about government investment, the president just recently announced his Connect Ed initiative. They're going to put $200 million into wiring schools all across the country. And one of the things they're going to change, you go back and look at this, is built off of the old E-rate program. And the E-rate program a couple of years ago spent $950,000 on pagers. Right? So that's the kind of thing where the government has to go in and reform itself to allocate money. When was the last time anyone had a sky pager? I don't know. But the government's got to figure out how to reform itself. So on top of that $200 million, you've got $750 million coming in from the private sector to make sure people have access in schools, but then people also need access at home.
Spencer's chopping at the bit here.
And federal government's important, private sector is important, but these municipalities, regionalism, working together is key. In Detroit, that was one problem we had growing up in terms of, city and suburbs not necessarily working together as well as they might, right? So regionalism, these folks, different entities working together, I think is key in terms of economic development.
Well, and creating regional focuses from an industry standpoint that builds manufacturing, that creates, I think really to your point, Jamal, some opportunities for the education to shift, to focus around some of that infrastructure. I've seen in the city of Cleveland, the mayor there have been 4 major motion pictures made in Cleveland in the last year and a half to 2 years. How can cities begin to take advantage of shifts in new industry, not just technology, but just new industry, so that there's now jobs and opportunity that you never would have thought existed? I mean, and that's an innovation issue. How does that happen, right? How does a local mayor, city council, county commission, that regional board begin to get together to think out of the box enough to create opportunity where there didn't exist without necessarily spending more money?
You know, I looked at some of this for a long time ago for an urban area, and the biggest influence is you've got a lot of people coming out of schools inside of communities. Instead of states and localities going around trying to steal business from each other with these marketing programs, you've got to keep the talent that's already growing up there, invest in that talent, create the resources for them there to grow up. It's a longer term strategy, but it has a greater likelihood for success and stability.
And I'll just add to that, Jamal mentioned earlier entrepreneurship. And so as these individuals are coming out of school with these great ideas and they want to start their business, there's a real need to make sure that they succeed. We still know that while small business is one of the key drivers of economic development in the country and a job creator, most of them fail within 3 to 5 years. And the hurdle to get from being an owner-operator business to actually being profitable and being able to hire is a huge hurdle. So the National Urban League has entrepreneurship centers around the country, and that's what we focus on, is helping both those startup businesses to grow to the point that they can become job creators, and also to help those that are already semi-established to really become strong and successful.
Well, and the key too is that entrepreneurship is really going to be one of those factors that levels the equity playing field.
That's right.
And we look at people like my grandfather, who was an auto worker his entire life, but he grew vegetables on the weekends and he sold them at the farmer's market. I mean, he had 6 kids in a house, you know, and a car and, you know, a wife. And so, you know, we may all get our kids these great new jobs, but they're going to also have to think about what are they doing outside of the workplace where they're working for someone else that can help bring their families into some more economic opportunity.
And not being adverse to risk, right? To a certain extent in the past, being the doctor or the lawyer, that was success in the African American community. This notion of being able to start and run a business and take some risk needs to be valued.
Well, and it also comes down to just being able to earn a living and the reality there. But with this city piece and looking at some of the disparities, I think we talked a little bit about the nuances of Washington, D.C., where you have a ton of African-American people earning great money. And then a bunch of people that are making little to no money. So you've got the earning, but the equity piece is still off. How do we address that even within our own community, in places where you've got cities that have done well, but the wealth gap is still so incredibly depressing, and you don't have a narrative about the working poor?
Right.
Well, you know,
you tried to get the bid.
well, this is a short story. The other day, the New York Times had a story about 3 17-year-old kids. They were white kids who started building apps for themselves at home. They were making $30,000 off of an app they were selling on the iStore. They just went down to South by Southwest. We have got to have a different culture inside of our homes of getting our kids to think about what the resources they have, and then as parents, enable those resources and help those kids to take chances while they're still in the nest so they can grow up as entrepreneurs also.
And I think that there's also a complicated conversation around, to your point about DC, the challenges around concentrated poverty geographically. So the African American middle class in DC is living in DC or in certain areas in Prince George's or Montgomery County or Virginia. The poor African Americans in DC are living further and further to the outskirts of Anacostia, right across the border into Maryland. And the census data recently started to show that this is a national trend. Poor Americans, low-income Americans are moving further and further from the city centers as those property values increase, and that exacerbates existing challenges. Now you have to take 2 buses and a train to get to work. And so not only are we making it more difficult for the working poor, but we're also separating them from the ecosystem of opportunity. So even the ability to engage with these kids who are building apps, is that happening in your school? Do you know anybody who's building apps? I loved it when you mentioned the point about Connect Ed. We need the schools connected, but if you're not connected at home, you're not doing that experimentation and innovation.
And it goes beyond being connected too, because then it becomes about what are you consuming. We talk about this all the time, right, Jamal? I mean, you can get somebody broadband, but if they don't know what to consume, they're just on Twitter. Before you all get out of here, so much of this is still about leadership, right? And we spend a ton of time and money and resources on electing presidents and almost nothing on electing local mayors. And some of the cities that we're seeing being most effective, and it's not about personality, it's about really smart people that are being elected into local office. How are we encouraging some of our best and brightest to do municipal level elected work and municipal level service? Are you seeing that in certain cities? Where do we see that young kind of group coming up as a model? And how do we encourage it the same way we are into technology, into medicine, into sciences, and so forth? So the kind of leadership we can have in these cities moving forward will have the economic minds as well as the social minds to be able to turn the needle on some of these issues.
Well, you know, at the Joint Center, we were founded to assist Black elected officials in terms of, as they started out, moved from being civil rights activists to elected officials. We're trying to get back to those roots, and back to the roots not necessarily in terms of, you know, entrenching people who have been there forever, but this notion of support, supporting just kind of this emerging generation of folks who are interested, who are smart, who are committed, who aren't in it for self, but in it for community. And, you know, we really want to be the think tank for that emerging group.
Well, you know, what else is happening in a lot of these communities is that there are new demographic changes that people have to acknowledge, right? And so now you're seeing, for instance, Detroit has its first white mayor since 1972. Right now in New York, you've got Bill de Blasio, who won a huge number of votes from African Americans. I think the racial dynamics that dominated many of these cities are now starting to get more complicated as Latinos move in, as African American middle class have issues that are separate from African American underclass. And so we're going to see some intra-racial kind of contests taking place.
Well, and also the reality that if we don't begin to engage folks looking at politics as something you do actually after you actually learn something, before you do, then we can keep getting a certain kind of politician. Let me thank you all so much for joining us for this discussion. There's so much more that we have to talk about, but what I'd like you all to do is share this web series with your social media friends and followers and continue this solution session using the hashtag #JobsForAll. You all have to get involved for there to be a difference. The State of Black America web series has been presented by AT&T. Thank you, AT&T, for your continued support of the National Urban League. We also like to thank Comcast for their production support of the State of Black America web series. Together, we are empowering communities and changing lives. You can always follow me at Jeff's Nation on Twitter. But for more information on the State of Black America and to purchase the book, which I recommend you do, visit the National Urban League at NUL.org.